Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. When talking about Islam, especially if someone is newly introduced to Islam, there is always this question: who wrote the Quran? How did it come into existence? The answer is not very simple. A short Islamic answer to the question is that the Quran is the direct spoken word of Allah, who is almighty, all-knowing, and omnipresent according to Islamic belief. Muslims believe that Allah spoke his word directly through Gabriel to Muhammad, who then revealed it to his followers. But in reality, it went through a huge and questionable process. I want to go through that process with you, provide some information, but also look at it from a critical, skeptic perspective. The actual Islamic belief, held by the vast majority of Islamic scholars, is as follows. Muhammad was a merchant in Mecca, Arabia, in the 6th and 7th centuries. For a while, he had dreams that reportedly came true in reality, which no one can prove, of course, and he loved going to a cave called Hira and retreating for a while, whereafter he would go to Khadijah, his employer and wife, to discuss his spiritual activities that he claimed he had. One day in the cave in 610, when he was 40, he was suddenly visited by the angel Gabriel, who told Muhammad to read. Muhammad said, "I can't read," so Gabriel squeezed him and told him again to read. At this time Muhammad was like, "I can't read, what am I supposed to read?" And Gabriel squeezed him again so hard that Muhammad was overwhelmed, and Gabriel recited the first verses of the Quran. Recite in the name of your Lord, who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught men that which he knew not. These 5 verses are believed to be the first revelation and are in today's Quran in chapter 96. The chapter has more verses than that, but those are believed to have been revealed at a later time. During Muhammad's entire lifetime, there was no book called the Quran. The Quran was only verbally revealed by Muhammad, verse by verse, depending on what he had to deal with currently, and it was written down and memorized by people around him. Muhammad would praise people who memorized the Quran and would give others the duty to do so. That's why more and more people who trusted him memorized his words, which he claimed were from Allah. That's why memorizing the Quran is still seen as a very honorable and pious thing to do in Islam, although it had no special meaning in other contemporary cultures like the Romans, and has no big importance in today's time, where you have little gods in your pockets. Only when Muhammad died did his followers come together and decided to compile all the Quran verses and turn it into one book. There were hundreds of people who memorized parts of the Quran, and dozens of people who wrote down Quran verses, dozens of scribes who had separate written parts of the Quran. The Sunni belief is that hundreds of those who memorized it were killed in a battle after Muhammad's death, under first Caliph Abu Bakr's rule, and that Umar, who would later become the second Caliph, urged Abu Bakr to compile the Quran. Abu Bakr then gave a man called Zayd ibn Thabit, who was Muhammad's scribe, the mission to compile all verses that were scattered among scribes. In a narration, Zayd says that this was an almost impossible thing to do. And the hadith also points out that Muhammad never ordered or did such a thing. According to vastly approved evidence, Muhammad never explicitly stated the idea to compile all the Quran verses into one book. Zayd did his best and collected everything he found, even from the memorizers. And he put together this collection with the help of few other people. From an objective point of view, especially among historians, you would never trust the authenticity of something that was brought together by one person from completely unknown origins and then later on turned into a huge book by again multiple other people. Considering that we are talking about Arabia in the 600s, it's even less credible, because Arabia didn't have a history of credible reports and books. But in Islam, you could view this as a miracle, because it's certainly not believable, it's certainly not trustworthy. And by adding this Quran verse, you have to believe that it was a miracle. Indeed, it is He who sent down the Quran, and indeed it is He who will be its guardian. That's not all. According to Islamic belief, even after this happened, there was not one single form of the Quran. There were so many different ones, with verses varying among the owners. Also, Arabic was not a strong and unitary language. There were many different dialects and ways to read a text, and since Arabic didn't have very well outlined rules back then, the scribes and the readers had their own versions of the Quran. That's why a task was initiated, most probably by Uthman, the third caliph, to unify the Quran by creating one canonized form of the Quran which would overrule all other Qurans. The purpose was to create specifications of vowels and diacritical points in accordance with one specific dialect of Arabic, so that the Quran cannot be understood differently by reading it differently. Because in Arabic, a word can be spelled the exact same way, but can have a different outcome as meaning depending on how you read it. Look at this, for example. All of these are spelled the same way, but have different meanings. The vowel indicators and diacritics define the meanings. Uthman wanted to prevent this and created a final canonized supreme version of the Quran and ordered to burn all other copies. According to Islam, not all of the copies were burned, because some refused to burn the copies and others just went unnoticed. That's why there are still different versions of the Quran alive today, which contradicts with the common Islamic belief that Allah's word can't be changed. I mean, Allah's word can't stay unchanged if Allah's word is different in every text to begin with, right? Some who know about this suggest that the differences were very little and insignificant, but that's not true. The different ways of reading the Quran can change the meaning minimally or very much. Most Muslims only trust in the current version of the Quran because that one was declared by Uthman to be supreme, a human, a regular Muslim and political ruler, 20 years after Muhammad's death. That's why Islamic teachers prefer not to teach their Muslim students transparently and clearly about this, but that's why you have me. This was basically the history of the Quran summarized in its vastly accepted form by the consensus of Islamic scholars. As for why the Quran is not in chronological order, Muslims don't have a clear answer on that. But most of them agree that Muhammad was the person who told his followers to rearrange the chapters of the Quran. As you know by now, Muhammad would just speak and his followers would make notes. According to the general belief, Muhammad would speak the verses and then tell his scribes that what he just said goes in this or that chapter. This is the Islamic scholarly consensus. I'm not making this up. Muhammad died in the middle of the process, and that's supposed to be Allah's plan. That's it. To make it short, all that is how the Quran came into existence. Today it has 114 chapters and 6,236 verses. Verses that were allegedly spoken by Almighty God through his angel to a merchant in Arabia, who then revealed all these verses to his scribes in the Arabian desert in the 7th century. But the question was, who wrote the Quran, right? If you follow Islam blindly, the answer is Allah wrote it, sort of. If you don't follow the Quran, you should know the fact that the Quran was written by multiple people over a quite long period, which is a weird thing for a book that is supposed to be Almighty Allah's direct word. Especially if we want to follow the common Muslim belief that the Quran is uncreated, meaning it was not simply produced by Allah in Muhammad's time, it existed long before humans. Although Muslims believe that the Quran is Allah's word, it looks very much like it was actually Muhammad's word. But after going through such a long process, did it really protect what Muhammad said? Was it really a divine mission, a divine message? It's very questionable. Is this really Allah's uncreated direct word for all eternity, for all humankind? I will leave that to you. Thanks for watching.
Rasulullah, as soon as the Quran would come down, would have a separate lesson for the new male companions and a separate lesson for the new female companions. The male companions felt that they were part of the Quran, but the females as well. Why? Because he knew that this religion would remain preserved by the mothers of the nation, correct? If the mothers had a love for the Quran, then you'd find that the Quran would be preserved. The first thing he'd do when the Quran was revealed, there'd be a separate class for the men and a separate class for the woman. That would be number one. Number two, he'd create a passion and fervor by saying, Whoever listens to the Quran and whoever recites it, both of them get an equal reward. The listener and the reciter. So the Sahaba straight away, as soon as the Quran would come, Ammar bin Yasir, for example, let's say, would look at Ali ibn Abi Talib and say to him, recite for me, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Ammar would listen, Ali would recite. Then Ali would tell him, recite for me Surah Al-Muddathir. Ammar would listen, Ammar would recite, Ali would listen. That fervor would be created, that passion to hear each other recite this book. Thirdly, he'd tell them, memorize the Quran. Make sure that whatever verses I bring you, keep them to your memory. As one hadith says, make sure you refresh your memory of the Quran, for it may escape your mind quicker than the hobbled camel. The hobbled camel was a phrase which the Arabians would use in their time. Rasulullah said, make sure you refresh your memory of the Quran. So the early Muslims would go to classes. Then the early Muslims would do what? They'd listen, they'd recite, they'd memorize. The fervor and the passion was psychologically important, because he wanted them to understand that they were as much part of the Quran as he was. Finally, what would he do? He'd encourage them to learn writing as an important faculty in their community. What do I mean? At the end of the Battle of Badr, for example, when he wanted to release the prisoners, he would ransom them by saying, teach some of the Muslims how to write, and then I'll ransom you, correct? Then you had some verses in the Quran which would say, O you who believe, when you give a loan, write the loan. The writing culture he wanted to begin to instill in them. Because at the beginning there was only about 40 odd, minimum 17, who were able to read and write in Mecca. Many people were not able to read and write. He wanted to instill in them a passion for writing, so that any documents, any forms, any scribes which need to be written, they would have that fervor for it. Rasulullah would have scribes under him. These scribes, the Sahaba, they would be the ones he would instruct to write the Quran. He teaches them exactly how to write. And I tell you one thing, if you were to read the way he asks them to write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, this is exactly what the hadith says. When Iqra, for example, is revealed, you have to write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, correct? If me and you were to write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, how would we write it? Yes? Who cares the length of the ba, the sin? No. I'm your prophet. I've just received a revelation. This is how Bismillah is to be written. First he says to them, dip the wool in ink. Yes? Then sharpen the pen. Yes? And then after that what? Make the ba upright. Separate the teeth of the sin. The sin has teeth, doesn't it? Separate the teeth of the sin. Do not blot the meme. Wow. You got to be careful with this book, correct? I'm not just going to haphazardly get someone and just say to him, right. Ali ibn Abi Talib and Zayd bin Thabit were the two closest of the 43 scribes of the Quran. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib and Zayd bin Thabit, correct? They were the two closest to Rasulullah. He'd say to them, get the wool, dip it in ink, sharpen the pen. The ba, make it upright. The sin, separate the teeth. The meme, don't blot it. Allah, write it well. Rahman, elongate it. Rahim, write it neatly. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib and Zayd bin Thabit were the two closest scribes. They wrote the Quran. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, 100% in every school in Islam, there's a belief that he wrote the Quran. There is no doubt about that. What happened was that Ali, Zayd, as soon as the Quran is revealed, Rasulullah would call Amir al-Mu'mineen. Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, sit next to me. Yes. Right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now Iqra. The alif like this, the qaf like this, the ra like this, the alif like this, and so on. But the question is, what would he write the Quran on? Because what Zanjani says there are 43 scribes of the Quran. What would they write the Quran on? Some people would turn around and say, well, it's obvious, they'd write the Quran on paper. Paper, yeah, Habibi, paper today, we have lots of paper. In those days, you never had lots of paper. In those days, do you know what you used to write on? Think about it as an Arab. If you're an Arab, what would you really be writing on? Leather, some say. Others say wood. You hear leather, you hear wood. Some of us have got part of it right. Shizaz was a type of wood in Arabia. So some of them who could afford the shizaz would write the Quran on the shizaz wood. Yes? Others would write the Quran on silk, harir. So a person would say, you know what, I want to be one of the scribes of the Quran. So he buys harir, silk, and he writes the Quran on silk. Others would write the Quran on what? Usub. Someone says, what's usub? You've seen the large leaf of the date palm? The broad side of it, the broader side, you'd collect it, and some of them would write the Quran on the broader side of the usub. Some would write the Quran on a likhaf. What's a likhaf? White clay tablet. You buy a likhaf, and you come and you write the Quran on the likhaf, but it's a white clay tablet, quite big, so you can write lots of verses, correct? Yes, on the likhaf. Some of them would write the Quran on a dhil'. What's a dhil'? Rib. The rib of an animal. These are Arabs. Got all these animals around you, you hunt them, you've killed them, there's some bone remaining, you get the rib. On the rib, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. خلق الإنسان من علق. Others would write the Quran on aktaf. The shoulder blades of a camel. They'd get the shoulder blades of a camel, yes? So imagine you just barbecued this whole camel, and there's this big shoulder blade left, yes? You know the Nundu area, yeah? So you would take this whole area, let's say the shoulder blade area, and you would write the Quran on that, yes? So what you have? Some wrote the Quran on silk, some wrote the Quran on wood. Those who had access to the qartas. Qartas means what? Qartas means paper. Surah 6 verse 7 of the Quran mentions the qartas, because the Quran gives you a hint of the ability to write. The Quran mentions qalam, suhuf, qartas. We give a hint of scrolls, paper, pen, but it's not that simple. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib would either use silk, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib may use likhaf, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib may use the usub, Zayd bin Thabit may use the aktaf. You see, in those days, paper was expensive. You don't have Sahaba going around and saying, you know what, can we order about 1 million pieces of paper? No way. So what you do is you think to yourself, you know what can I afford? I'll afford shoulder blade, I'll afford, for example, the rib, I'll afford, for example, a white clay tablet, and I'll write them on the Quran. I then take them to Rasulullah when I've written, and I show Rasulullah, Ya Rasulullah, have a look on what I've written. Rasulullah would look at the shoulder blade, he'd look at the rib. These companions were so passionate and dedicated that they would write every word of Rasulullah. They couldn't wait to go and see him. In other words, the qartas, harir, likhaf, usub, aktaf, dhil', all of these were used to write the Quran under the supervision of the Holy Prophet. A question arises here on this note. When they were writing the Quran, when they've written the Quran and all of these, and now you've collected the whole Quran, correct? You've got all of these pieces, you've collected the whole Quran. Who ordered the surahs? Because imagine, you've got all of these surahs now. Who orders the surahs in their order? Why do we ask this question? Because someone turns around and says, hold on a minute. You said Surah Alaq, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. You said that the order was what? That it was the first surah. If it's the first surah, why is it Surah 96? Have you ever wondered that? Iqra is Surah 96 in the Quran. But hold on a minute, it's the first surah. What's the second surah to be revealed to the Holy Prophet? Anybody know the second surah? Qalam. Qalam is which surah in the Quran? Say 67, yes? Lots of hard work in the last weeks really been going on. Then say, what's the third surah in the Quran? Yes, let's say, Muddathir. Then after that, Muzzammil. Muddathir and Muzzammil are surahs 73 and 74. So hold on a minute, the first 4 surahs of the Quran to be revealed to Rasulullah, yes? The first 4 surahs of the Quran to be revealed, 96, 67, 73, 74. Why not just make it a chronological book? There are different opinions. One opinion is the Quran is not a chronological book. Who said the Quran is a chronological book? Yes, the Bible tells you the history of man, yes? And the creation. Who said the Quran is that? The Quran is a way of life, not a book of history. Firstly. Secondly, some people had the opinion, which I must admit, I in my research disagree with, but this is their opinion. They say, Iqra, when it was revealed, the first 5 only are revealed verses. The first chapter to be revealed fully is which one? Think about it. Logically, what's the first chapter to fully be revealed? Fatiha, exactly. So they said that the reason Iqra is not the first surah in the Quran is because not the whole surah was revealed. Until the whole surah was revealed, made it number 96. So they said Allah put the arrangement of the surahs in which arrangement? Allah put the arrangement of the surahs according to which surah is fully revealed. I differ with that opinion. Why? Because what's the second surah of the Quran? Baqarah. But were all 280 odd verses of Surah Baqarah revealed in one go? I don't know. I tend to side with the chronological. That, you know what, the Quran is not chronological. Quran is not a history book. Allah orders His Prophet orders His scribes, and then there's a third opinion, the opinion of Amin Islahi, and I think it's an interesting opinion. Amin Islahi says, Rasulullah chose the order of the Quran because how? When you look at the last verses of one surah, they connect to the first verses of the next. Have you ever thought about that? The last verses of one surah connect to the first verses of what? The next surah. How? Surah Al-Baqarah ends, Surah Al-Fatiha ends with us saying we want guidance, correct? Do you agree? اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Do you agree? Surah Al-Baqarah begins by saying, you want guidance? The greatest guidance is the Quran. Surah Al-Baqarah ends by saying that mankind will never put a burden on his soul which he can't handle, correct? Surah Al-Imran begins by saying, if you want to be guided and not have a burden on your soul which you can't handle, then don't neglect the holy books like the Torah and the Injil and the Quran which we sent you. Surah Al-Imran ends by saying we want to achieve taqwa, correct? If you read the last ayahs of Al-Imran, it talks about how we want to be of the muttaqeen. Surah An-Nisa begins by saying you want to be a muttaqi, don't forget your social obligations to men and women in your community. Do you understand? The idea of Amin Islahi was what? Amin Islahi said, when you examine the order of the Quran, the order was definitely constructed by Rasulullah, not the Sahaba. Rasulullah said, Baqarah goes here, or Fatiha goes here, Baqarah, Al-Imran, Nisa, Ma'idah, An'am, A'raf, Anfal, Tawbah, Yunus, and so on. He's the one who said how it all goes in an order, because if you look at the last ayat of one surah, they connect to the first ayat of the next. And I think it's an interesting theory. That it's a theory which makes a lot of sense if all of you ponder on the last ayat of surahs today and look at the first ayat of the ones after, you'll see there's a connection where there's an unbelievable flow taking place. So the Quran, therefore, it was written, Rasulullah ordered how each surah is to be placed. People like Abdullah bin Mas'ud and so on, they would say, we would recite the Quran in front of Rasulullah, and Rasulullah would tell us that this is where this surah goes, that's where this surah goes, and so on. Question, when he gave them that Quran and when they wrote it, did it have kasra, dhamma, fatha, madda, dots? No, it didn't. Why didn't it? Because when you know your language well, do you need all the vowels there, or can you flow when you read? Those of you here who speak, for example, let's say Swahili, or Gujarati, or Urdu, or Arabic, or Farsi, or English, do I need to see every vowel when I read? Or when I read properly, I can flow and I know how everything's meant to be said, correct? At the beginning, the Quran, while there may be evidence, plausible evidence, that there were dots in Arabic at that time, and I think it's plausible evidence, the Quran didn't need dots on it. Why? You already knew, or even the vowels, you knew that this is the laws of how to read. So therefore, when did we have kasra, dhamma, fatha? We had it first by the student of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen called Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali. Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali is the founder of Arabic grammar. Whenever you study Arabic grammar, they all go back to him. And he learnt Arabic grammar from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen taught him the laws of Arabic grammar. In other words, the Quran was preserved by the Prophet, the Quran was honored by the scribes, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt were present.